addressed not through the administrative state, but through the courts in a way that might have more impact on the most serious cases.
Give me an example of where the agency functions well according to how you just described it.
So I would say that during the Trump administration, under the Trump Executive Order on Combating Anti-Semitism, the agency sent a strong signal that institutions can't use double standards and that they need to address discrimination against Jewish students the same as discrimination against other sorts of groups. There have been other ways in which it's acted well. During the George W. Bush administration, I had the honor of overseeing a enforcement initiative that addressed misidentification of certain racial and ethnic minorities in special education programs that were not appropriate to their learning and in their conditions. Sometimes the agency gets it right and is able to provide students and their families with an environment which is equal to those of other groups. Sometimes it can be heavy-handed and inappropriate.
The case that you described under George W. Bush, that's where students were being, basically students who were fully functional, but just, I guess, illiterate, were being classified as having special needs or something like this? Or...
So, for those of us who remember the George W. Bush administration, you might recall that President Bush was very big on reading issues and on providing research-based reading instruction in the public schools, as opposed to some of the more politicized approaches to reading that weren't working. Now, civil rights agencies don't teach people how to read, but what we were finding is that there were some schools where inappropriate and ineffective reading programs were leading to high literacy rates disproportionately among racial and ethnic groups. Some of those racial and ethnic groups who were not being properly taught on reading were then, in some ways, injured twice. First, by not getting the best kind of reading instruction, and then they were misidentified as being either mildly mentally retarded in some cases or as otherwise mentally disabled in ways that just weren't true. And because of that, they were denied educational benefits that were appropriate to who they were. The problem wasn't with the kids. The kids were fine. The problem was with the grown-ups who were miseducating them, leaving them uneducated, and then giving up on them, thinking that they couldn't be taught simply because they were being taught badly, and then pushed aside into a special education program that was just wrong for them.
My sense is that this sort of situation has actually only gotten worse since those years. What's your view?
Some of the data shows improvement, but schools vary. Certainly during COVID, closure of the schools led to all sorts of problems, especially among those people who were perhaps poorer or in certain minority groups. There is a whole generation that is just now recovering from not just COVID, but from the rush to close the schools down in the wake of COVID. Beyond that, despite decades of a U.S. Department of Education, we're not doing any better in educating our students. If anything, we're now doing worse. We're denying an appropriate education and denying choices that families should have as to how to educate their kids.
So give me an example then when the department doesn't function well, again, per your description earlier.
Well, for example, when it misuses a so-called disparate impact approach to civil rights. That's a notion, at least as it's often misused, that says we shouldn't just ask whether students are treated differently based on their race or national origin. We should also ask, apart from intentional discrimination, whether there are neutral approaches to education that have an adverse impact on some groups. So if you find out, and this is always the case, that approaches have statistical deviations, that it might be that in a particular school, African Americans might be suspended more often than, let's say, Asian Americans. If you find out significant statistical disparities, it's possible that there is intentional discrimination at work, and it's worth investigating to find out whether students are being intentionally treated differently based on their race. But if you don't bother to do that and you just say it's bad to have statistical discrepancies, we won't suspend African Americans until we have an equal percentage of Asian Americans who are also treated in that way. There are all sorts of problems that arise from that, and some of the problems involve principals and teachers who are just unwilling to discipline students who are causing problems, and that leads to safety issues for everyone, including often minorities within the public schools.
Yeah, no, I'm remembering there was one particular, student mass shooting situation, which was a student that just had kind of repeatedly, there'd been repeated attempts at disciplining it, repeated attempts at solving, but just kind of kept falling through the cracks, like, presumably because of this sort of an approach.
Of course, when there is a mass shooting, that's an extreme case, and then there is often a debate within the public as to the cause of that shooting, including whether it is part of a general problem of students made unsafe as a result of a misuse of civil rights laws. Regardless of whether a particular case you can actually come to the ultimate truth or not, it really is the fact that across the board we have to worry about educators that are focused less on education and more on keeping the federal bureaucrats and federal enforcers at bay in ways that could tie their hands, reduce their judgment, and ultimately make the students less safe.
Ken, we're going to take a quick break right now, and we'll be right back.